"You're fired." The words exploded through the underground garage like a thunderclap. Every sound suddenly stopped. Engines went quiet. Footsteps froze. Even the faint hum of the elevator seemed to fade as billionaire Charles Whitmore stood beside his black luxury sedan, his face red with anger. "You heard me, Marcus," Charles barked again. Marcus Johnson stood silently beside the driver's door. For 7 years, he had been the man behind the wheel of Charles Whitmore's car. Every morning before sunrise, Marcus would arrive early, clean the vehicle, check the route, and wait patiently. But today was different. Today he had arrived 20 minutes late. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied quietly. His voice was soft, controlled, almost gentle. That only made Charles more irritated. "Don't yes, sir me like everything is normal," Charles snapped. Marcus lowered his eyes respectfully. "I apologize, sir." Charles paced across the polished marble floor, his expensive shoes echoing sharply through the massive garage. "I had an important meeting this morning," he continued angrily. Marcus nodded. "I understand." "No, you clearly don't," Charles shouted. Several employees nearby pretended to focus on their work, but everyone was listening. The security guard by the elevator shifted uncomfortably. Marcus had always been the quiet one in the building, the man who greeted everyone politely, the one who stayed late without complaining, the one who never caused trouble. But Charles Whitmore wasn't thinking about any of that. "All I ask is simple reliability," Charles continued, annoyed. Marcus remained still. His hands were folded in front of him. 7 years, Charles said sharply. Marcus looked up slightly. "Yes, sir." 7 years you've worked for me," Charles continued, cold. Marcus nodded again. "Yes, sir." "And today, the one morning I absolutely needed you to be on time, you decide to stroll in late?" Charles said bitterly. Marcus hesitated for a moment. It looked like he wanted to explain something. His lips moved slightly, but then he stopped himself. "I'm sorry, sir." Charles threw his hands into the air. "Sorry doesn't help me now." The building manager, Mr. Collins, slowly walked closer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, Marcus has always been one of the most dependable people here." Charles turned sharply toward him. "Dependable people don't show up late," he replied coldly. Mr. Collins hesitated. "Well, maybe something happened this morning." Charles cut him off instantly. "I'm not interested in excuses." Marcus didn't speak. He simply stood quietly, absorbing every word. The tension in the garage felt heavy. Finally, Charles pointed toward the exit. "Pack your things," he said firmly, cold authority. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He reached up and removed his driver's cap. It was a simple black cap with the Whitmore logo embroidered on the front. He had worn it almost every day for 7 years. Marcus looked at it for a moment. Then he gently placed it on the front seat of the car. The gesture was small, but it carried years of quiet service. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir," Marcus said respectfully. Charles didn't even look at him. "Security will process the paperwork," he said impatiently. Marcus nodded again. "Yes, sir." The security guard looked uncomfortable, but stepped forward slightly. Marcus picked up a small worn bag from the passenger seat. Inside were simple things: his lunch container, an old notebook, a bottle of water, a phone charger. 7 years of routine packed into a single bag. Marcus gently closed the car door. For a brief moment, his hand rested on the roof of the vehicle, almost like saying goodbye. Then he turned and began walking toward the elevator. His footsteps echoed softly through the silent garage. No one said a word. Mr. Collins watched him leave with concern. "Sir, maybe we should reconsider," he said quietly. Charles checked his expensive watch. "No time for second thoughts," he replied sharply. "But Marcus never causes problems," Mr. Collins added uneasily. Charles shrugged. "Well, today he did." Meanwhile, Marcus stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut slowly. Inside the small space, Marcus leaned back against the wall. He closed his eyes briefly. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. The elevator slowly rose toward the lobby. When the doors opened, the bright sunlight from outside flooded the room. Marcus stepped into the large glass lobby of Whitmore Tower. The same lobby he had walked through every morning for 7 years. The marble floor shined. The receptionists were busy answering phones. Employees rushed past carrying laptops and coffee cups. But today felt different. Marcus walked through the front doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cool morning air brushed against his face. Cars rushed by on the busy street. People hurried to work. No one noticed the quiet man standing there. Marcus slowly turned and looked up at the massive building behind him. Whitmore Tower stood tall against the sky. For 7 years, that building had been part of his life. He took a slow breath. "Well, life moves on," he whispered softly. He slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out his old phone. The screen had a crack in the corner. A notification message appeared. "Hospital update. Surgery successful. Patient stable." Marcus stared at the message. Relief filled his tired eyes. "Thank God," he whispered. He placed the phone back into his pocket. Then he adjusted the strap of his bag and began walking down the street, step by step, calm, quiet, dignified. Back in the underground garage, Charles Whitmore climbed into the back seat of his luxury sedan. A temporary driver sat behind the wheel. "Let's go," Charles said impatiently. "Yes, sir," the driver replied nervously. The engine started. Just then, Charles's phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen casually, then suddenly froze. The caller ID displayed a powerful name, Governor Daniel Reeves. Charles immediately answered. "Governor Reeves, good afternoon," Charles said professionally. The governor's voice came through calm but serious. "Charles, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Charles straightened in his seat. "Of course not. What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause. Then the governor asked a strange question. "Is Marcus Johnson still your driver?" Charles frowned slightly. The question caught him off guard. "Well, actually, no," he replied slowly. The governor became quiet. Charles continued casually. "I fired him about 10 minutes ago." The silence on the other end suddenly became heavy. Then the governor spoke again. "Charles Whitmore, please tell me you're joking." Charles felt a small knot form in his stomach. "No? Why?" he asked. The governor exhaled slowly. "Charles Whitmore, you may have just made a very serious mistake." Charles sat up straight. "I don't understand," he said. Another pause followed. Then the governor said something that made Charles's heart skip. "Marcus Johnson isn't just a driver." Charles's eyes widened. "What?" Charles Whitmore sat frozen in the back seat of his car, the phone still pressed against his ear. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "What did you say?" Charles asked slowly. Governor Daniel Reeves' voice remained calm, but there was a clear weight behind his words. "I said Marcus Johnson is the man who saved my daughter's life." Charles blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. "That can't be right," Charles murmured. He rubbed his forehead, his thoughts racing. "Marcus? My driver?" he asked again. "Yes," the governor replied firmly. Charles leaned forward in his seat, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't understand," he admitted. Governor Reeves let out a slow breath. "Then let me explain," he said quietly. Charles listened carefully. "This happened 3 years ago," the governor began. Charles tried to remember that time. 3 years ago, Marcus had already been working for him. "My daughter, Emily, was driving home from a charity event late at night," the governor continued. Charles swallowed. The road was wet. Visibility was poor. Charles could hear the emotion in the governor's voice. "Her car lost control and crashed into the highway barrier," Reeves said. Charles felt his chest tighten. And then the car caught fire. Charles's eyes widened. "Fire?" he whispered. "Yes," the governor replied. "It started small, but within seconds the flames spread through the engine." Charles leaned back slowly, stunned. "There were other drivers on the road," the governor continued, "but no one moved." Charles frowned. "Why?" he asked quietly. "They were afraid the car would explode." Charles felt a cold chill run through his body. People stood there, watching. Charles closed his eyes briefly. "And Marcus was there?" he asked. "Yes," the governor answered. "He was driving your car that night." Charles tried to remember that evening. Marcus had returned later than usual. Charles had been annoyed at the time, but Marcus never explained why. Governor Reeves continued speaking. Marcus saw the accident from the opposite lane, he said. Charles listened silently. He immediately stopped the car on the shoulder. Charles pictured the scene in his mind. Rain falling, smoke rising, panic on the road, and then he ran straight toward the burning vehicle. Charles sat up suddenly. What? He ran toward the flames, the governor repeated. Charles shook his head slowly. That's insane, he murmured. Governor Reeves' voice softened. My daughter was trapped inside the car. Charles felt his stomach twist. The doors were jammed from the crash. Charles leaned forward again. So what did Marcus do? He asked quietly. He picked up a metal tool from the road and smashed the driver's side window. Charles's breathing slowed as he imagined the moment. The fire was already spreading across the front seats, the governor added. My God, Charles whispered. Marcus reached inside, cut the seatbelt, and pulled Emily out of the car. Charles was completely silent. The governor continued. He carried her away from the vehicle. How far? Charles asked. Just a few steps, Reeves said quietly, because seconds later, the car exploded. Charles's eyes widened. Exploded? Yes, the governor said. The entire engine burst into flames. Charles leaned back against the seat, completely overwhelmed. And Marcus was still there? He asked. Yes, the governor replied softly. He stayed with Emily until the ambulance arrived. Charles ran a hand across his face. I had no idea, he whispered. That doesn't surprise me, the governor sighed. Charles frowned. What do you mean? The governor's tone became thoughtful. Marcus never wanted recognition. Charles remained silent. I tried to publicly thank him, but he refused. Refused? Charles repeated. Yes, Reeves said. He told me something I'll never forget. Charles leaned closer to the phone. What did he say? The governor paused. He said, I just did what any decent person should do. Charles felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. For years, Marcus had quietly worked for him, driving, waiting, opening doors, and never once mentioning this. Why didn't he tell me? Charles asked softly. The answer was obvious. Because he didn't think it mattered. Charles stared out the window of the car. The city streets moved past, but he barely noticed them. Marcus never talks about himself, Reeves continued. He only cares about doing the right thing. Charles swallowed. I just fired that man, he whispered. The governor's voice grew firmer. Yes, you did. Charles closed his eyes. Because he was late. The words hit Charles like a hammer. I didn't know any of this, Charles said weakly. Governor Reeves replied calmly. Did you ask him? Charles froze. The answer was obvious. No, he admitted quietly. The governor sighed. Charles, do you even know why he was late today? Charles shook his head slowly. No. The governor spoke again. He was at the hospital this morning. Charles felt his stomach drop. Hospital? He repeated. Yes, the governor replied. His mother had surgery at 5 o'clock this morning. Charles sat up straight. What? Marcus stayed there all night, Reeves continued. He didn't leave until she woke up after the operation. Charles felt guilt flood through his chest. And after that, he still went to work. Charles's voice barely came out. I didn't know. The governor replied firmly. You didn't ask. Charles stared at the phone. Every second felt heavier than the last. Charles, the governor said quietly. Yes, Charles answered weakly. I called you today for a reason. Charles listened carefully. I'm creating a new transportation security team for the governor's office, Reeves explained. Charles frowned slightly. And I wanted Marcus Johnson to lead it. Charles's eyes widened. You're serious? Completely, the governor replied. I trust him with my family's life. Charles felt another wave of regret. And now he doesn't even have a job, Charles said quietly.
The governor didn't respond for a moment. Then he said something that cut deeply. Sometimes the people we overlook are the most valuable ones we have. Charles swallowed hard. The truth of those words hit him hard. Finally, the governor spoke again. You should find Marcus. Charles straightened immediately. Yes, you're right. Before someone else does, the governor added calmly. The call ended. Charles slowly lowered the phone. For a moment he sat completely still. Then suddenly, "Stop the car!" Charles shouted. The driver slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt. Charles threw the door open and jumped out onto the street. He looked down the sidewalk in the direction Marcus had walked. "Marcus!" Charles shouted. And then he started running.
Marcus! Charles Whitmore's voice echoed down the busy sidewalk as he ran forward, his polished shoes striking the pavement hard. People walking past stopped and stared in confusion. A billionaire running down the street was not something you saw every day. "Marcus, wait!" Charles shouted again. About halfway down the block, Marcus Johnson slowed his steps. He turned around slowly. His expression showed surprise as he saw his former boss running toward him. "Sir?" Marcus said quietly. Charles finally reached him, slightly out of breath. For a moment he couldn't speak. The powerful businessman who controlled companies worth billions was suddenly struggling to find words. I need to talk to you," Charles said, catching his breath. Marcus adjusted the strap of his small bag on his shoulder. "Yes, sir," he replied calmly. Charles looked at him carefully. For the first time in years, he truly saw the man standing in front of him. Marcus looked tired. His eyes carried exhaustion. His clothes were simple, his posture humble, but there was a quiet strength in him, a dignity Charles had never noticed before. "I made a mistake," Charles finally said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waited patiently. Charles swallowed hard. "I fired you without knowing the truth," he continued, ashamed. Marcus gave a small nod. "It's all right, sir," he said calmly. But Charles shook his head firmly. "No, it's not all right." Marcus looked at him with mild curiosity. Charles took a deep breath. "I just spoke with Governor Reeves," he explained, uneasily. Marcus's expression changed slightly. "Governor Reeves?" he repeated softly. Charles nodded. "Yes, he told me everything." Marcus lowered his gaze slightly. There was a long moment of silence. "You saved his daughter's life," Charles said quietly, astonished. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "It was a long time ago," he replied simply. Charles stared at him. "A long time ago?" he repeated in disbelief. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Charles shook his head slowly. "You ran into a burning car." Marcus shrugged lightly. "She needed help." Charles looked almost speechless. "You could have died," he said. Marcus looked thoughtful for a moment. "Maybe," he replied calmly. Charles felt something heavy inside his chest. "And you never told anyone?" he asked, baffled. Marcus gave a small smile. "I didn't think it mattered." Charles let out a slow breath. To him, that act was heroic. To Marcus, it was simply doing the right thing. Then Charles spoke again. "And this morning," he said carefully. Marcus listened. "You were late because you were at the hospital." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Charles' voice lowered. "Your mother had surgery." Marcus's eyes softened slightly. "She did." "Is she okay?" Charles asked, genuine concern. Marcus nodded. "The doctor said the surgery went well." Charles looked down at the ground for a moment. Guilt pressed heavily on him. "You stayed with her all night, didn't you?" Charles asked, sad realization. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." "And after that, you still came to work?" Charles said quietly. Marcus shrugged lightly. "It's my job." Charles felt deeply embarrassed.
He had fired a man who spent the night at a hospital with his sick mother and still showed up to work. "Marcus, I'm sorry," Charles said sincerely. Marcus was surprised. In 7 years, Charles Whitmore had never apologized to anyone. "Sir," Marcus began, but Charles raised his hand gently. "No, please let me say this," Charles insisted. Marcus remained silent. Charles looked him directly in the eyes. "I judged you without asking your story." Marcus listened quietly. And that was wrong. The words felt unfamiliar in Charles's mouth, but they were honest. "I let my anger make the decision," he continued reflectively. Marcus studied his face carefully. For the first time, Charles Whitmore looked like a different person, less powerful, more human. Charles took another breath. "I want you to come back," he said, hopefully. Marcus blinked slightly. "Come back?" he repeated. "Yes," Charles said quickly. "I want you to have your job again." Marcus thought for a moment. "Sir, you already replaced me," he said calmly. Charles shook his head. "That doesn't matter." Marcus looked thoughtful. Charles continued, "And there's something else you should know," he added, important. Marcus waited. "Governor Reeves wants you to lead a transportation security team for the governor's office." Charles Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Me?" he asked quietly. Charles nodded. "Yes, he trusts you with his family's life." Marcus looked down for a moment, processing the information. "That's unexpected," he admitted humbly. Charles studied him carefully. "You deserve it," Charles said sincerely. Marcus remained silent for a moment. The street around them buzzed with city noise. Cars passed, people hurried by, but the moment between them felt still. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Sir, may I say something honestly?" he asked calmly. Charles immediately nodded. "Of course." Marcus looked him directly in the eyes. "I never worked here because of the money," he said quietly. Charles listened carefully. "I worked here because I believed loyalty still meant something." Charles nodded slowly. "It does." Marcus studied his expression. "And I stayed because I believed you were a fair man." Charles felt the weight of those words. "I hope I can still prove that," Charles said quietly. Marcus looked thoughtful. Then a small smile appeared on his face. "I'll come back," Marcus said calmly. Charles felt a wave of relief. "Thank you," he said quickly. But Marcus raised one finger slightly. "On one condition," he added firmly. Charles immediately nodded. "Anything." Marcus spoke gently. "Next time someone makes a mistake, ask their story first." Charles paused. The lesson was simple, but powerful. He nodded deeply. "I promise." Marcus extended his hand. Charles shook it firmly. For the first time in 7 years, they shook hands not as employer and employee, but as two men who finally understood each other. As they walked back toward Whitmore Tower together, Charles realized something important. Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest hearts. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never talk about their courage. And sometimes the biggest lessons in life arrive through the smallest moments. Because respect should never depend on someone's job. True character reveals itself in actions, not titles. And a person's worth is not measured by their position in life. It is measured by the strength of their heart.